Hello, beautiful community. Now, some of you are worried about what's happening in American domestic politics, and you're asking yourself questions about the sustenance of support for Ukraine and whether Ukraine might not eventually be edged into some kind of fraught or unsustainable peace. And what I want to do is not give you an analysis of this, but I think speak to some of your worries by exploring how we might be clear about the way we think about all of this, and maybe make a couple of comments also about our discourse about this. So we're going to take on that issue, but we're going to take it on indirectly. And I just want to sort of almost place a bunch of points on the canvas and hope that cumulatively they're a bit helpful to us. So I don't know, 12 minutes together. Let's have a go. Let's see if we can do it in 10 even. Tiny point. Let's just get through it straight away. Obviously, when you look at the West's position, you have to make a distinction between what's said in public and what the real position is. And you shouldn't be conspiratorial and assume that the gap between what's said in public is as big as the distance to the moon, but you also shouldn't be naive and think that there is no gap at all. Small point. If you look at discourse in, but not only in, the United States, that is, Ukraine support skeptical, the three main lanes it comes through are the following. Not our thing, not our war. Get the ruler out, measure the distance between Ukraine and the United States is a big distance, not our war. That's one thread. One lane. Another one is maybe it is our war, maybe it isn't, but we can't win it. What we're doing is investing big into a scrum, and the difference might be 20k this way, 20k that way, in terms of how the line between Russia and Ukraine ends up. We are investing money into a situation where we might gain Ukraine some advantage, but we're not going to transform the situation via this investment. Therefore, it's insupportable. The third lane is, in my view, the most toxic, actually. Toxic in the sense that it has a lot of power and a lot of pathologies besetting our democracies that affect it. It starts with a kind of truth that's exaggerated, but then plenty of pathological baggage is attached. And that is, how do we know where our money is going? And how do we know where our stuff is going? And here, Ukraine is indeed unlucky that there is something there that can be exaggerated. Then the Nazi story about Ukraine is just not true. Just not true, really, in any kind of perspective. But the corruption story has a lot of truth to it. And that's exaggerated to give the impression that the support we're giving and the money we're giving is to an intolerable degree being wasted. That's obviously not my view at all, but that's a seed that is then cultivated into this position. What is toxic about this, why it's so deep and pathological, is that the idea that goes with this thought, Ukraine's wasting all our stuff, is the thought that our institutions can't be trusted anymore to do anything, right? So the argument about we don't know where our money is going, we don't know where our stuff is going, is actually fundamentally, more than anything else, an expression of, but also when used by political agents, an exploitation of a massive lapse in trust in public institutions. So fundamentally, we don't know where our money is going. It's actually not about Ukraine. It's fundamentally about America. It's about loss of trust in American institutions, as it were, knowing what they're doing and being in the position to be trusted. So these are the three lanes to look out for. Number one, not a war. Number two, we can't win it. Number three, we can't trust our institutions that are delivering this stuff, to deliver it in a way that's efficacious anyway. Next point on the canvas. We have to see the fundamental conflict between the pro-Ukraine support and the Ukraine support skeptical sides in Western domestic politics and American politics as really being between a side that says this isn't about our national interests enough, or maybe it is but we can't win it, or maybe it is but it's not effective. There's no effective way of us offering the support. But the center of all of this is that we're sort of in the business of protecting our interests, and either we don't have any there or we can't protect them effectively anyway. And that's the anti-support, anti-Ukraine support side. The pro-Ukraine support side has to be fundamentally seen as being about national interest. And that is not just generally true, in the sense that it's always been true throughout the war, but it's especially true now that the war is dragging on, that there is indeed democratic exhaustion to a certain extent in Western countries with the subject. And that is why it's above all important to get the idea across that if you're going to make an argument about supporting Ukraine, the main arguments have to be about Western interests and the United States national interests. And here all of our stories about what the Kremlin is up to and Putin's escalation come in. It's important, but secondary, to talk about helping Ukraine in terms of a humanitarian need, or a need based on principles of however hypocritically held, but principles of right and justice. That matters too, but it's secondary. So you've got to, if you're on the pro-support in Ukraine side, you've got to have your main story be a story about how it is strongly in the US interest to support Ukraine. Next point on the canvas. And maybe here we can reflect a little bit on the place of expertise, Western expertise in this conflict, in this brutal imperialist assault that the Russians, that the Putin regime is orchestrating. And I'll start with that and then move to an actual point about Ukraine sustaining support. It's an ethical and professional failure of many experts who are very pro-Ukraine that they don't criticize Ukraine, or don't criticize Ukraine and don't create a congenial space for others to criticize Ukraine. I think there are plenty of people who do/would criticize Ukraine, Mark Galeotti, for instance, but there is a lot of Western experts who are not criticizing Ukraine, and I think this is a serious ethical failure of expertise, a failure of understanding how to appropriately balance your role when you're above all communicating with the public. And here it's worth saying that expertise is a great thing, activism is a great thing. Expertise that works well is great, activism that works well is great. What is more questionable is when there is a situation where you can't tell the difference between the two, when expertise and activism sort of seep in and out of one another, and you can't tell where one ends and one begins. And it's that kind of wash that often produces a situation where Ukraine's not getting criticized. And it's very important to criticize Ukraine, number one, for truth, and number two, because if you criticize Ukraine, it becomes even more compelling if your big picture conclusion is overwhelmingly and fundamentally pro-Ukrainian. Right? It strengthens your points. Right? It strengthens your points when you say the story about Nazism in Ukraine is BS, if you say, okay, there's a big corruption problem and so on. So in the light of this business of criticizing Ukraine being an important business, let's do a little bit of that at the level of Ukraine's foreign policy. And I don't want to be as strong on this as a lot of people are privately, and as, for instance, Ukrainian philosopher who's in Ukraine still, Andrei Baumeister, who said that the chosen style of Ukrainian foreign policy, and especially Ukrainian foreign policy discourse in recent months, has experienced a catastrophic and irreversible collapse. What he means is that Ukraine's style has been counterproductive and has riled people up instead of creating a situation where Ukraine can squeeze more support for itself. Now, he thinks probably that style may have been more effective in the first months of the war, but is less effective now. But I want to say that there is not one, but there are three criticisms of Ukrainian foreign engagement. And improving on all of these three areas, I believe, increases the chances of Ukraine getting more weapons and more support for longer from the West. Number one, it is indeed the Baumeister point, which is about style of communication. And here we're not just talking about the ex-Ukrainian ambassador to Germany, Mr. Melnik, who said lots of proactive things. It's not just Mr. Melnik, it's other people too. And there is indeed a palpable sense that plenty of statements coming out from Ukrainian officials are jarring and counterproductive. But something even more important than that I think is implied by what Baumeister says, but it doesn't make it explicit, is that there is insufficient engagement by Ukraine with forces in Western politics that are less than obviously supportive of them, right? So we're wanting not just a style that is appropriate to late 2023, early 2024 style of communication. Evolution of the style, something may have been appropriate in 2022, it isn't now. Evolution of the style. Number two, smiling when you want to vomit and engaging with various kinds of political forces in the United States, in Europe, in Britain, that are first of all, not unambiguously pro-Ukrainian, or that are just not in power, that might come to power, and it's worth in a preemptive way beginning to engage with them. So, engagement. And then, while these two are the criticisms that are being widely discussed by a lot of people behind the scenes, the third criticism is my special criticism, that hasn't been discussed that much, and it's that Ukraine should be politicizing the ex-Soviet space much more, rather than making a series of, offering up a series of apolitical remarks about Russia or Belarus. Now, this is difficult because your public discourse, especially when you don't have a very rich intellectual elite, your public discourse contracts at wartime, and it's hard. But the trouble is that if Ukraine doesn't pay enough attention to getting rid of the kind of politics you have now in the Belarusian space, in the Russian space, it can't make a strong enough argument about how it is at the forefront of a potential reconstitution of politics on that whole space, which is something the United States would be terribly interested in. So funnily enough, Ukraine is potentially engaged in something more important than some of Ukraine's own discourse allows. And if Ukraine were in the business of much more robustly saying, hey guys, we are at the forefront of a big tension between something like a modern democratic republic and authoritarian imperialism on this space. It's not just about us. It's huge bits of space too. And political transformation is important there. The generation of conflict on these spaces is important. Political transformation of these spaces is important. That also is a hugely powerful argument for Ukraine to make that very nicely feeds into this being not about the United States helping Ukraine, but the United States acting upon very basic global interests, and that are, given United States global presence, American interests too. So style, engagement, that's perhaps even more important than the style. And number three, at the level of both style and engagement, a bigger emphasis on the politicization of the ex-Soviet space. So that's enough for today. We're going to talk about all of this much, much more. Lots of love.